beginning Advent this morning at the beginning of the Gospel of John, in John chapter 1, verse 1. John 1:1. In the beginning, the Word already existed. He was with God, and He was God. He was in the beginning with God. He created everything there is. Nothing exists that He didn't make. Life itself was in Him, and this life gives light to everyone. The light shines through the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. God sent John the Baptist to tell everyone about the light so that everyone might believe because of his testimony. John himself was not the light. He was only a witness to the light. The one who is the true light, who gives light to everyone, was going to come into the world. But although the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him when he came. Even in his own land and among his own people, he was not accepted. But to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They are reborn. This is not a physical rebirth resulting from human passion or plan. This rebirth comes from God. So the Word became human and lived here on earth among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son of the Father. May the Lord open his word to our hearts. So when you see a good movie, good movies have a way of ringing true to life. They pull us into the story. And it doesn't always matter whether they happened in our time period. They could have been thousands of years ago or even in a galaxy far, far away. But there's something about the stories that connect with our everyday lives, whether it's the challenges that the characters face or the things that they go through. Sometimes it's the joys or the struggle of life. But there's something about the story that pulls us in and we relate to our everyday lives. It's either how our lives are or the way our lives we wish would be. And so it always has some point of connection. There are ways that movie makers accomplish that. Sometimes, like I say, they bring in struggles and they'll have the characters go through things and they'll start off and you go, how are they ever going to do this? And then they overcome obstacles and we're inspired to overcome our own obstacles. But there's things that they do to kind of make the story at least line up a bit with what we go through and how we see life and how we understand things. And there's another way that they do it. And that is that they often write a backstory for the characters. So even though the story has a beginning and an end, maybe not at the birth of a person, there's kind of a background that person has. And so they write the character's backstory. And even if it doesn't get brought up in the movie, there's things that kind of inform how the actors play that part. So it's a little less flat and a little more three-dimensional and a little more like our lives. Because the truth is, if we look at our story, we look back and we see the things that happened to us as children. And we see the experiences we've had and that time when we started to kind of come into our own as a teenager and you started figuring out who you are and what your life's going to be about and choose your career path and all those things. And as we negotiate life, as we rack up experiences, isn't it true that we're shaped by the things that we've been through? And sometimes those things shape us in a way that's negative and sometimes in a way that's positive. Sometimes negative events can have a really positive impact on us if we learn to rise above and we learn to kind of deal with our struggles. And other times a really negative experience can cripple us and can really leave us at a disadvantage in life. And there are also good things that happen to us. And if things go too well for us, we kind of can get a little soft maybe. But other times, good things will inspire us, and we'll say we'll learn about ourselves, and we'll believe in ourselves a little more. But whatever it is, the truth is that the reason that it works in movies is because in real life, nobody kind of becomes the person they are without having gone through what they've gone through. And so even if we don't walk around telling everybody our backstory and telling everybody what we've been through, it impacts how we look at the world. It impacts how we're able to trust people. And it impacts how we build relationships with people and how things play out in our lives in lots of different areas because of what's happened to us and what we've been through and how we've faced things and what kind of decisions we've made along the way. And I bring all that up because as we look into the scriptures, we find that we can get a little familiar with the Christmas story. And every year we talk about the same story, right? It's Mary and Joseph getting on the donkey and riding to Bethlehem and finding no place in the inn. And Jesus is born there in the stable and laid in a manger. And then the shepherds, they see an angel and then a host of angels. And then they come running. And at first the baby's born, it's just Mary and Joseph. But then there's a bunch of smelly and hard-working shepherds hanging out there. And then before long, at some time in the future, there's the wise men that come. And so we set up our nativity scenes and we think through the details of this story and we get so familiar with it that it starts to grow a little cold. And so this Christmas, as we go through Advent, I want us to look at the backstory of those events. We want to back up the camera from a close view of just that intimate little setting inside the stable, inside the barn where Jesus and Mary and Joseph are all alone and with no place other than this to be. And Mary has to give birth in that circumstance. And if we back up the camera, even beyond the shepherds and the star above the manger, and even beyond the wise men that are traveling from a far distance, if we go further back in time and further out from that scene, but we start to understand what the backstory is to this moment in history. Because even though we look at that one moment and we think something so significant happened there, to understand what happened in the manger, you've got to understand what led to this moment in human history. And so, as the gospel writers unpack the story, Mark is the shortest gospel, the earliest written, and he just jumps right to Jesus' adult life. And he tells the story of the things Jesus taught and Jesus' public ministry and his death and his resurrection. But he leaves it at that. And then we got Matthew. And Matthew starts the beginning of his story with the narratives. And so he tells the history of who was in Jesus' family tree and ties him back to King David and what had happened there. And so he wants to point out to his Jewish-speaking audience, the people of God, that this man is born into a significant lineage. He is born to be the Messiah that was promised to David. He's to come and be the King of Kings. David was their ultimate king, but he's coming to be a bigger king than David ever was. And so Matthew starts the story there in the family history and the lineage of Jesus. And then you got Luke, and Luke tells us all of those birth narratives that we know about Elizabeth and Mary being visited by angels, and John the Baptist's birth, and then Jesus' birth, and how Joseph was told that he should still marry her anyway. And so all the details of our manger scene, a lot of them are kind of covered in Luke. But this morning we read from John's gospel. John is the one gospel writer that tells the story from a completely different angle. Maybe that's why I love John so much, because he just has to be different. And so he stands out in that he takes the story and he says, look, if you're going to understand what happened in that moment in history, if you're going to jump to the moment where Jesus is born in a manger, then you need to understand some things that lead up to that. And I'm not just talking about the things that happened right before it. I'm not just backing up to when Mary is visited by an angel and told her that she's going to have a baby. I'm not talking about that far back. We're going to go way, like as far back as you can go to tell you the beginning of the story so that you can understand what happened. And so as he writes his prologue, he starts with a really epic starting. And you know that in good literature, there's always kind of a really fantastic beginning to some stories. And you might recognize, like if I say to you, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Do you recognize that? Charles Dickens? And so in writing his Tale of Two Cities, he says it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Like both things are going on at the same time. There's really bad things happening, really good things happening. Or what about if I look back at that other classic of literature, the sun did not shine, it was too wet to play. So we sat in the side on that cold, cold, wet day. We sat there. Do you not recognize it? Famous author named Dr. Seuss with the Cat in the Hat. Okay. And if you're not a reader at all, you got to get this one, Once Upon a Time. Now, we might not all be thinking about the same story with that one because it's so good a beginning that they used it for all kinds of stories. But you know the kind of story you're about to hear when you hear Once Upon a Time, right? It's a fairy tale. It's going to have an elaborate story. There might be a little moral message in there, not necessarily a true story, but it's going to have some meaning and going to be good for children. Well, to set the stage for the story that's to follow in the Gospel of John, he starts with these words, in the beginning. Sound familiar? Feel like you've heard it somewhere before? Maybe the very first words of the Bible, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the earth was formless and void. Remember that? So the very beginning of the story of God with humanity begins with creation, and it begins in the beginning. This is what happened. This is how the world was created. And John backs up, and he uses that classic beginning for a reason. He says, in the beginning, the Word already existed. In the beginning, the Word already existed. He says, there's this thing or person called the Word, and it already existed in the very beginning. Before creation, it was already in existence. And so he opens his story that way to let you know that this Word was there before anything was made, before anything ever happened to anything or anyone. In the beginning, the Word already existed. He was with God and he was God. He was in the beginning with God. He created everything there is. Nothing exists that he didn't make. So John starts his prologue and he says, remember the story of creation? Well, the story of creation did not unfold without the Word being there. He was there in the beginning. He created. Nothing got created without him. Nothing happened that he didn't make. He was part of creation and not like on the sidelines of it, like he's not holding the flashlight. He's doing the work. He's the creator of all things. He created everything there is. Nothing exists that he didn't make. That's the claim he's making for the Word. So we're still talking about creation, but this time we're learning something new about this scene. The Word is there, and he created everything. The Word was with the Creator. The Word was the Creator, and he makes everything. Now, if you have been around the church very long, then you probably heard in recent days that you remember we went through a little hiring process. There was an announcement in the bulletin, and we hired Emma Hanneman, and she works in our office, and we get to have Emma makes all the screens for us for Sunday, and she sends out the newsletter and does all of that. But Emma is also doing something else. She's growing a baby. Like you might have noticed that she's very, very pregnant. And sometime in the next month or two, there's going to be a new member of WWCC, and we're really excited about it. And so Emma and Mitch are expecting, and if you remember, if your parents here you remember that feeling, don't you? And no matter how long ago it was, don't you remember that feeling? Your firstborn child, you're waiting and anticipating and wondering what they're going to be like. Me and Roxanne, we didn't find out what gender our baby was going to be. There was no gender reveal party. We didn't have the balloons or the cake, the pink or the blue. We didn't do any of that. We just waited, and we found out when she was born. But long before our daughter Emily was born, she was an idea. And so at the beginning, before Roxanne was even pregnant, there was just this idea that someday we're probably going to have kids, and will we have a boy? Will we have a girl? What would that be like? What kind of personality will she or he have? And is that going to be like being parents? And how are we going to raise her that's the same as our parents? And how are we going to raise her that's different than our parents? And what kind of things are we going to try and instill in her? What kind of lessons are we going to try and give her? And I thought about what it would be like to have a baby girl, but she was still an idea at that point. It wasn't really her. It was just the idea of her, the supposition of what she might be like, the possibility of what a daughter of mine and Roxanne's might end up being like. And then when Roxanne was pregnant with Emily, it became a little more real, and we had to make real concrete plans, and we got a nursery ready, and we bought things, and we prepared things, and we knew we needed a car seat to get home from the hospital, and we need to have a place for her to sleep. And then it started to really sink in. We're going to have a child. We're going to have to figure out some things. And we're going to need to learn some skills. And we're going to need to know how to raise her, how to feed her, and how to change her diapers and do all that stuff. All of a sudden, the idea was a little more substantial, right? And as she was forming in the womb, she wasn't everything that she is now, but she was starting to kind of grow as a person. And so she didn't have the personality or any of those traits, but she was there physically. And we hadn't met her yet, but we thought about her. And so we had plans for how to raise her, and it wasn't till she was born that we really got to look at her. But even then, like, she didn't have all the personality, like newborn babies, the only thing they do is cry and poop, and there's more to her life now. Like, there's a little more to her than there was back then. But that's where it began. And so I say that and tell you that because when we look at the prologue to John, there's this idea that it conveys. So when it says the Word was with God and the Word was God, nothing was made without him. The word in the Greek was logos. And the logos had kind of become an idea, and it was more than just a word, the word. And so why they refer to this person that created the entire universe as the Word, why John does that is he says, look, Greek-speaking audience, you understand what this word is because this word idea became wisdom. And so they looked at the logos as kind of wisdom, and then it became personified wisdom. It was like if wisdom was a person, not if a person had wisdom. We meet some people who have at least a measure of wisdom. But if the person was wisdom itself, that's the idea of the logos. And so when John's starting his gospel, he says, if you want to know what wisdom really is, it's this guy. And who is this guy? He's the person that created everything. Like nothing was made without him. Everything was made by him and for him, and the whole thing rests on him. That's the person I want to tell you about. And so John begins his gospel by unpacking this cosmic scene of creation, saying this word, this wisdom, it was there in the beginning. It created everything. And so we know from the Old Testament that God created the heavens and the earth. And so he says, this logos, this word, this wisdom personified, it made the entire universe. And so that's who we're talking about. And so he unpacks his story and he says he's wisdom. He's always existed before creation. He created the world. He has life in him, and he gives light to everyone. And then he unpacks it and says, like John the Baptist, he came pointing to this wisdom, to this light, to this person who created everything. John wasn't it. Like, John was just pointing to the light. But the person who's coming is not just a person who is filled with light. He's not just a person who has wisdom. He is light. He is wisdom. He's the creator of the entire universe, and that's who's coming into the world. And so he says John pointed the way to him, and he was supposed to get things ready, but yet he came into the world and they didn't recognize him. He says, although the world was made through him, the world didn't recognize him when he came, even in his own land and among his own people. They didn't get it. They didn't track with what was happening. And so you and I, we look at this prologue and we hear it unpack and we say, God who created the entire universe, and then John starts to unfold it and say, John the Baptist came before him and he was coming into the world, and then he moves right into the neighborhood. He comes to earth, and we go, we know who that is, right? We know who's coming at Christmas. It's Jesus. And so Jesus is born, but before the manger, before two peasants give birth to a baby and stick him in a manger, before the shepherds, before any of that scene, way off in the distant history at the very beginning of time, Jesus is there creating with the Father so that he and the Father are one in creation, and they are both active in the creative act of the entire universe. Which incidentally, even though it's never spelled out in the story, remember when it says that God created mankind, he says, let us make man in our image. Like, he uses the plural there because it's not just God the Father. And the Spirit hovers over the deep. Like, all three are in on the act. And so Jesus, who's part of creation, who creates the entire universe, is the same Jesus who's born in soft, pink, vulnerable flesh in a manger. And if you're going to understand what happened in the small village of Bethlehem, outside of an inn, in the middle of a barn, to that baby who's laid in a manger, if you're going to understand what's going on there, you got to understand what happened at the beginning of time and who it is that's wrapped himself up like that. I mean, babies are amazing, and to watch them grow and to develop their personalities is incredible. I'm getting really excited about watching Emma and Mitch raise this little one. I don't even know what their personality is going to be like, but I got a feeling it's going to be fun to watch. But Jesus is born, and he's the most, he's a baby, and there's nothing more vulnerable than a human baby, right? Like, they're vulnerable to sickness, and they're vulnerable to predators, and you don't want to leave them unattended. You got to keep them safe from choking hazards. Like there's all these dangers, remember, that you were warned about. All these things that you had to do to make sure you raise your child so that they're healthy and strong and safe. And you look at them when you first bring them home, and you're like, how am I going to not break this person? Like, what would happen if I dropped her right now? You're so careful, and you're so worried about them because they're so vulnerable. And that same vulnerable little baby that Mary held in her hands and just went, what am I going to do with this? I don't even have a safe place to put this baby's head. Like, he's going to have hay sticking into his back if I put him in here, but this is the only spot we got. And that vulnerable little baby is the same one that sprinkled the stars in the sky and created all the planets and the sun and the moon and everything on our planet, all the animals and the life forms that we have on planet Earth, and everything that was ever made was made by him. And he goes from the power of creation, the power to put everything together, to this little ball of pink, vulnerable flesh. From speaking the world into existence to having to learn how to talk. He's so big and he makes himself so small. And he's so strong and powerful and he makes himself so vulnerable. And so when people were looking for a Messiah to come from God to rescue them, when they see this scene, they do not understand. And so John says, look, you got to understand how big he was and how powerful he was, to understand how vulnerable and how small, and the trip that he made from there to here, and how much he gave up to be here on earth among us, how humbling it is. Nobody has ever started from that height and gone to this depth like him. And yet, even when he does that, the God of the universe is lying in a manger and nobody understands and nobody gets it. He says he even came to his own people and they didn't recognize him at all. The people who worshiped God, the people who were God's people, missed the whole thing. And other than a few smelly shepherds, who, God bless them, at least were warned and decided they would believe, Mary and Joseph were alone in it with this baby. And so although people were oblivious, John goes on to say, but to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They are reborn, not a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan. This rebirth comes from God. He says everybody who believes in him gets to start over. You remember that blank slate you felt like your child was? Like, I wonder what they're going to grow up to be like. Are they going to be as stubborn as me, or are they going to be as kind as their mom? And what kind of personality traits are they going to develop? Are they going to just be their own person? And all those things that we think about when they seem like, you know, they're a baby and they're a person, but they haven't grown into their personality yet. And he says that we get to start over like that. We get to be reborn, not that we start over our physical lives, but that we can start over fresh with a clean slate as if we were just born yesterday. And we can start over for all the things that we've gotten wrong. And that God gives us the right to do that, to be reborn, to start over, to get the ultimate do-over, to become children of God and to allow our identity to be that. To allow our persons to be shaped by who we are in Jesus. And he says that's what he did. Nobody recognized him, but he still, for those who would believe and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. We become his children. And even though Jesus' sonship, his being born of the Father is completely singular and alone and unique, we get to join him in the family. And so then John says, so the Word became human and lived here among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the only Son of the Father. And we recite in the Nicene Creed, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all worlds, God of God and light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made, who for us man and for our salvation came down from heaven and was incarnate by the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary and was made man and was crucified. also for us under Pontius Pilate. And so the creed goes on, and from early times, from the very beginning, and it was in 325 AD, like 300 years after Jesus' birth, Christians recited this creed. And the most important thing that they start off with is that, Jesus was not just our Savior. He is the creator of the universe. He is the one who put everything into being and called everything into being. And that's the same God that reduced himself to a baby. And even though he's very God, a very God, even though he's light, he became this baby, this tiny little baby. And he moved into the neighborhood and lived among us. That's the kind of God that he is. And so he was rejected, but some believed. And in the creed, they knew from the very beginning that it's significant that Jesus was God and is God. And so Christians have recited those creeds ever since. They believe those things ever since because it was essential to understand what Jesus did. You got to understand who Jesus is. And so Jesus stands out stark in human history. And I love how John says, the light shines through the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. Like he shines so bright that even though you may feel the darkness, even though the darkness may press in on you, you need to understand that that light can never be snuffed out. There's no power in the universe that could do it. And if you hold to that light, he provides for you to become his child and to know him. And so John ends with this word. He says, the Word became human and lived here on earth among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness. And we've seen his glory, the glory of the only Son of the Father. And then John goes on to tell the story of Jesus. He tells us how Jesus grew and developed. He tells us about Jesus' experiences. He talks about his miracles, and he tells us about his teachings. And he unfolds the story of his death and his resurrection. But in all of it, he says, you need to understand who was doing that stuff. It was God. And they were looking for a different kind of Savior. And they thought if somebody was going to come of the line of David that was going to be a warrior, it would be a big deal. But when the word came, what he was full of was unfailing love and faithfulness. And he lived out his love and faithfulness, and the world didn't recognize it. And they didn't recognize the light that he was, but his light could not be extinguished. And if we choose to believe in him, if we understand who he was and what he did for us, it begins in eternity. But then he comes to us. There's such a vast distance between who he is and where he was to where we are, but he bridges the distance, and he comes to us and doesn't wait for us to come to him. And when we understand how big he was, we understand how much he sacrificed. And we know what it is to know the light. And if we choose to believe in him, then we become children of God. And we know his salvation. And we know what it is to live in a light that can never be extinguished, so that the darkness is no threat to us, because we have the light of life within us.